Shabbat Shalom. Before I begin today, I want to just acknowledge that in these very heavy and serious times, it is all right to take some time with family and friends to laugh, to sing, to talk about light and enjoyable subjects. It is Shabbat, and it is a time for carving out a place of peace. But we live in a time of strife, and at the same time, perhaps a time of great hope. And as Jews, we always live in the in-between. So let's just be there with one another today until Shabbat is over, but thinking about the great subjects of our time. They are both joyful and sorrowful. And so in this in-between state, I'm going to ask your forgiveness if you have heard this story before, because it is one that stays with me and bubbles up, particularly at times like these. One winter afternoon in 1990, during my shift at a Beverly Hills bookshop, I was a retail clerk working part-time, a few hours a week. An immaculately dressed man was standing outside the shop. He had very dark skin. He checked his watch and looked up and down the street. The owner of the bookshop, his spouse, and the two senior employees gathered together to watch him through a two-way mirror in the back office. Then they called the police. While the owner was speaking with the local squad station, the man outside did the unthinkable. He entered the shop, picked up a book, and began reading the back cover. The owner, still on with the cops, cried into the phone, "He's in the store!" At that fateful moment, the man's friend drove up in a sports car. The would-be customer looked up, smiled and waved to his friend, put down the book, and exited the store to his companion's waiting car. The two friends drove away. I have replayed that scene so many times over the last now 3 full decades. I was 20 years old and old enough to know better. I'd been raised in San Francisco, an incredibly diverse city, and raised by colorblind parents. But I did not challenge my elders that day when fear and prejudice invaded and paraded through that shop and could have led easily to a disaster. To this very day, I am unspeakably grateful that the police did not arrive before that innocent man's friend did. That the only life changed forever that day was mine. Beware the eyes, for they lead you astray, is the thundering pronouncement of our Parshat, Shelakh Lekha. First, the spies are sent into Canaan to see and scout out the land. 12 of them go, and 10 of them bring a catastrophic assessment of the prospects for conquering Canaan. They declare it a bountiful land, but teeming with giants, casting themselves as grasshoppers in our own eyes, they said, and thus we appeared in their eyes as well. Numbers chapter 13. The Parsha closes with the mitzvah to place fringes on our garments, to be tethered to our tradition, less likely to be misled by the lustful yearnings of your hearts and eyes. The sections appear totally unrelated at first, but a closer look reveals them to be inextricably linked by an extraordinary dance of words. Moses sends men to scout out the land with their eyes, and the Hebrew word is veyaturu. The tzitzit, the fringes, are commanded so that we will not be led astray, lo taturu, by our eyes. The result of relying on visual stimuli real in the first case and potential in the second, is nothing less than whoredom, with the same Hebrew root meaning whoring, used in both parts of the Parsha. A rather damning indictment of what can happen when we rely too much on what we think we see. Seeing may be a kind of believing, but what we believe may prove entirely untrustworthy or even blatantly false. Eyewitness accounts are notoriously, sometimes dangerously unreliable. Jewish tradition knew this, vehemently opposing any visual or iconic depiction of the deity, and instead commanding us to open not our eyes but our ears, to hear, O Israel, that the Eternal is God, the Eternal is one. The spies not only saw everything out of proportion, they compounded it with the terrible sin of pretending to know what other people were seeing as well. The historic consequence was that they and their generation languished in the wilderness for that infamous 40 years, dying before reaching the Promised Land. Only Caleb and Joshua, the two spies who said, "We can do this," lived to cross over into Canaan. In their inability to see themselves and others in their right size, they exhibited a massive failure of humility, as taught by the Jewish tradition of Musar, the cultivation of the balanced soul. The 10 spies were humble, but far too humble. They shrank away when they needed to rise to the challenge. They gave disproportionate power to others, sapping their own strength and initiative, and sowing terror and self-doubt amongst their own people. That's what happens when we allow our eyes to get the best of us. In this heart-wrenching chapter of human history, we are felled by a blind and invisible virus, and we have again borne horrific witness to the result of pernicious racism that leads to certain people who wear a badge thinking that they're giants and that too many people of color, particularly and to our eternal shame, Black men and women, are grasshoppers to be crushed underfoot. At the same time, what we have seen, we have too often turned a blind eye to, refusing to acknowledge what is there, right in front of us. We have seen peace officers who know far better violate the command to not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, and lawful protests that should and need to be waged turn violent at the hands of people on both fringes of the extremes who cut swaths of destruction like the giants in old stories and treat innocent business owners and inanimate but valuable property like grasshoppers to be dispatched at will. It's been utterly out of proportion, and it's felt utterly out of control. Thank God, since I first thought about this a couple of weeks ago, since we all were forced to look at the situation in front of us, so many of the protests have been able to be nonviolent, but the protests can and must and will continue. I can't apologize personally to the good man who was profiled so long ago and so wrongly in that bookshop in Beverly Hills. But I can try with all of my soul, all of my strength, and all of my might to not ever repeat that awful and unwarranted rush to judgment, to not be swept up in mindless groupthink, and instead to live by the good and wise teachings of our ancestors, who knew so well that human beings succumb all too often to the weakness of the eye. This weekend, on Friday, we acknowledged a holiday known as Juneteenth, where the last of the enslaved blacks in Texas finally learned 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation that they were free. Too often, in the last 150 years, has the expression Black freedom been what Ralph Ellison called a gaudy illusion, something not real, not believable with our own eyes. We are now, as a community, as a civilization, having the veil removed from our eyes. What will we see? We are not grasshoppers. We are not giants. We are all human beings, more or less the exact same size. We are blessed with awareness and the chutzpah to say that we are, every single one of us, created in the divine image, that we all bleed red and cry salt tears, and there is divine light in all creation. There are fewer Calebs and Joshuas among us than not. The Torah was correct in its mathematical assessment. The struggle is great and the road is rocky. But the fruit of justice, like the bountiful fruits that the spies brought back from the land of Canaan, the grapes and the pomegranates and the figs of our Torah story, these represent the fruits of justice. They are large and sweet and there for the taking, if we will but reach out our hands. Like the fruit in our Torah story, it takes many to shoulder the carrying thereof. Let's bear that burden together, and may we live to see better times. Shabbat Shalom.